Derek Miedema grew up knowing how severe disabilities in a family can create both struggles and blessings. He's here to share some of his family's story. Thank you for joining us on Context.
Thanks for having me.
Derek, you are a researcher. You work for the Institute for Marriage, Family, and you know the ethical issues are swirling all around us and changing rapidly. Scientific breakthroughs, like we've discussed today with Dr. Owen, really impact your family because you have a severely disabled brother. Tell us about your brother, your twin brother.
Well, they do, yeah. My twin brother, we're two of five. Brian was born, as much as we can understand, with severe brain damage due to lack of oxygen. We turned 40 just recently, and as much as the doctors can determine, he has about a 3-month-old mental capacity. So if you look at Brian, he's in a wheelchair, he has epilepsy. We know that he can hear, we know that he can possibly see shadows. He's fed through a G-tube for the last number of years. If the average person was to look at Brian, I'm reminded of Alex's statement just in the previous segment. Many people might look at Brian and say that's not a life worth living. But our experience as a family is absolutely the opposite.
What has caring for him meant?
Having Brian in the family, I think as a young child, meant at the very beginning that we knew as brothers that the world didn't revolve around us because Brian had real needs. But more deeply than that, obviously, Brian taught our family that, and this came back later on in our lives, that a person has worth and value and meaning even if they can't do. That being human is what is foundational, and we care for each other regardless of how much we can do. And I know in my experience, and for all my brothers as well, Brian has taught us so much about what it means to be human. I think I see that God in some way has washed away many of the complications that we face, and I see Brian having an almost unadulterated joy or a peace that we don't have.
You know, we have seen the framework of the complexity of the medical technology around these issues. But your family also put a spiritual framework around yourselves. Tell us about that.
This framework developed certainly and was instilled in us from a very young age by our parents. The understanding and the experience that God is ultimately in control, that God is with us. An early decision of my parents not to send my brother to an institution but to bring him into our family told us that Brian was an equal member of our family. And we surrounded each other in the knowledge that God would continue to be with us every day. And as we cared for Brian, there's something about caring for someone who is profoundly vulnerable that softens us as we care for him.
You become better people.
I think we become better people. I think our wives would say, for example, that all of myself and all my brothers have become compassionate and concerned for those who are vulnerable because of Brian being part of our family.
This took another layer of complexity because your father was stricken with ALS.
Yes.
Tell us what lessons you then had to apply to caring for him in a very difficult state.
One of the first statements that my father made after his diagnosis was that we know from Brian that when a person loses the ability to do, they still are. And so we always knew from my father that as he lost the ability to walk, and as he lost the ability to use his hands, and as he lost the ability to swallow, and as he lost the ability to breathe, all of these things didn't rob him of his value and importance in our lives and didn't rob him of being human.
But some say God is cruel. If life means my 40-year-old brother has the capacity of a 3-month-old, my father is going to die a painful death from ALS.
You know, I think for my advantage, I guess, in this situation is that I've lived in the middle of these. I've lived in this family, and I've seen the good things that have come out of this. I know, for example, that one of the real insights that I gained through my father's illness in particular is that as a Christian, I can struggle to a certain extent, but then I had the sense that God says to me, this high and no farther, and above here, you're going to have to trust me. And it wasn't, you're going to have to trust me, but it is, I will help you learn to trust me in the areas that you can't understand. And now that I'm the father of young children and considering the long-term future and what the world's going to be like, that's an area I can't understand. And I bring what I gleaned from my father's life and death, and it now applies perfectly to this situation. So I've learned lessons that I carry with me. And I know that, it was clear to me, for example, at my father's graveside, that if there was no God, that was the end of my dad, and that was a black hole. But since there is God, not only will I see my father again, but I have the picture in my mind, I don't know if it's actually going to turn out this way, but that I will be able to, when Jesus comes back, stand at my father's grave and say, this is where he was resurrected to new life.
Derek Miedema, that's an amazing story. And thank you for bringing your family's incredible journey with your brother Brian and with your dad to this important ethical issue.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to try and wrap things up in a moment with some thoughts on dying a good death.
We want you to be a part of our studio audience. If you're in the Toronto area, contact us.
What are we to do when science makes a discovery that makes us rethink how we treat patients who we thought were better off dead? I'm going to quote a very old man on this one, Basil the Great. He was a church father who in 300 AD wrote, "The medical art is God's gift to us to relieve the sick, to remedy the deficiency in nature." Many centuries ago, Basil taught of opium and mandrake being used to stop violent pain. Christian ethics shaped our laws on dying ever since, and an ethos developed that said, live long enough to make peace with God, stop treatment when it becomes spiritually burdensome, because heaven is a better home. Times change, and now facing chronic care and eventual death without a Christian ethic is the new dilemma. In fact, we have a Supreme Court case asking for one family's religious freedom be respected to live longer. Surely, God's example of selfless love, of purpose in pain, of patience and care is still an ethic we will all need for the future. Send us your feedback on today's program. Call the viewer feedback line or send us a message or email. Today's topics may be a little bit too complex for Twitter, but perhaps Facebook you can give it an answer on. We would love to know your thoughts. So for all of us, I'm Lorna Dueck. Thanks for watching, and join us next week as we explore life beyond the headlines.